I invite you to be seated. So, you know all that stuff that we would rather not talk about with kids? I'm sure you could think of it. You know, it's stuff like violence, all of those things are really, really hard to talk about with kids. It's the stuff that, you know, even adults have a hard time talking about openly. Well, today, we're going to talk about all of it. Because I feel like the readings that we have today, well, they won't let us not talk about it. I mean, we could try. We could stick to those safe topics like faith and bravery and healing, and just pretend that there's nothing in here about stuff like violence or death or menstruation. I want to make sure I'm not going to get struck by lightning, because this morning at 8 o'clock I said that and the bishop showed up. Seriously. Plenty of sermons take that safer route. And yeah, there is enough to work from on these fronts, so we could avoid the uncomfortable, hard, and taboo topics. But I'm not going to do that today. You see, I'm taking my lead from David. David, of all people, is telling us that we've got to talk about the hard stuff. It's been 14 chapters since David came to prominence as the giant slayer, which is where we left him last week. 14 awful, violent chapters that our lectionary just breezes right over. We skip them entirely. In this interim, Saul becomes increasingly jealous of David's charismatic success, both on the battlefield and off. And he starts to dedicate more and more energy to blunting David's rise. Now, Saul starts with ploys like trying to keep David under his thumb by making him marry one of his daughters. But all of this very quickly graduates to stuff like sending David off to certain death in seemingly unwinnable battles, of which there were plenty to choose from. And then out and out attempts at assassination until it's settled into this sort of cat and mouse game that just seems like it's endless. Saul hatches plot after plot. He tries to hunt down and kill David, and you know what? David, every time, he escapes by some combination of cleverness and his close ties with Saul's inner circle, and of course, being favored by God. Now, Saul is portrayed as going mad in his hunt to capture and kill David. He's making bad choice after bad choice. All of them fail to hit the mark, but they still manage to leave this horrible trail of death and violence in their wake. Saul even tries to send his own son, Jonathan, to kill David, which is just crazy because he knows well that the two of them have been fast friends since the very minute that they met. Now, David, on the other hand, is portrayed as patient and long-suffering. He even spares Saul's life twice. I mean, we all know that history is written by the victor, and this part of the Bible was, in fact, written by David's PR team. You can kind of tell, right? But we really don't know how incredibly brutal this power struggle would have gotten by the end. In the meantime, Israel's foreign enemies have not let up either. There's battle after battle. Like I said, awful, terrible violence, and so many lives lost. Saul meets his end in the previous chapter at the Battle of Gilboa. Now, David is nowhere near. He's off in Ziklag, pushing back the Amalekites. But Saul faces the Philistines, and he watches all three of his sons killed in this horrible, horrible battle. In despair, Saul falls on his own sword rather than be captured and tortured. The reading that we get today is David lamenting all of this, the whole 14 chapters worth. Oh, how the mighty has fallen. His song, it warns of how even the fastest and the strongest warrior will bleed. David's saddened. He's saddened by Saul's death and the senselessness of it all. But most of all, David is grieved to his very core that Jonathan, who was his closest friend, is gone because of this endless fighting. This is David saying war is awful, and we don't talk about that enough. We need to tell our sons, or else we will watch them die just like Saul did. Now, I am sure that David grew up on the same kind of heroic epics that we tell children today. The ones about the victories of the brave and the mighty standing firm against overwhelming odds. But David, he would have heard them around a campfire. David, in this, he makes an order that his song is to be recorded so that it can get told around the campfires of the people of Israel too. Our translation names it as the Song of the Bow. But many scholars suggest that it would be better translated as the Song of Hard Things. David's song is telling the part of the story that we shy away from teaching our children because it's frightening, it's unflattering, it's difficult, and it is without any sort of clear answer. But David says we must. He orders that his people teach the hard things too. He says we'll struggle with teaching it, but we need to do it. And that's just as true today. I mean, I will never forget a meeting that I sat through when my kids were in young elementary school for a county-wide anti-bullying program. Most of the parent volunteers were too uncomfortable to read the picture book about Ruby Bridges. They wanted it struck from the curriculum. Now, these are people who had volunteered to teach about anti-bullying in their children's classrooms. But somehow talking about racism and school desegregation, even when that historical event was being told from a child protagonist's point of view, well, just felt too hard for them. I also remember when my kids were in high school, parents fussing over whether their high schooler should be allowed to see or perform the hit musical Spring Awakening. It was really huge back in the, 2009, 2010. It's a rock musical. It's based on, actually, though, a Victorian German play written by Frank Wedekind in 1890. And it's about teens who are left on their own to figure out what sex and pregnancy is because of all of the rigid social taboos in Victorian Germany at the time. The point of the play is that young people suffered, and some even died because adults wouldn't talk to them about sex. Ironically, Wedekind's original play was rarely performed and frequently censored until it was unearthed and brought to Broadway, set to punk music over 100 years later. And you know what? It's not just us that struggles with this. It was unbelievably difficult for me to convince the high school that I taught at in Lesotho in 1991 that they should say yes to their National Council of Churches when they offered to send out an AIDS educator for the students. Now, it took me, who had just spent my college years watching the AIDS crisis unfold in San Francisco, and the geography teacher from Uganda, which at that point had already been decimated by AIDS. It took us days to convince our school administration. I mean, we knew how many of our students would leave our village within a year or two in their late teens to work in the mines in South Africa, where the HIV virus was just starting to hit. So we were adamant that this educator should be allowed to have that hard, difficult conversation that could very well save our students' young lives. There's another word for these hard topics. It's called taboo. Taboo just means stuff that we would rather avoid talking about. Only not talking about it can in fact start to be like a disease in and of itself, because making something taboo to talk about can turn out to be deadly. Boy, today's gospel is full of stuff that we don't want to talk about. And yet we get to watch Jesus take on all of that stuff that's taboo in his own culture too. Now, today's gospel is a side-by-side telling of two healing stories. One, a gravely ill 12-year-old girl, and the other, a woman who has suffered from some sort of vaginal hemorrhaging for that same period of 12 years. I could spend time trying to pin down exactly what ailed both of them, and if in fact the girl was dead when Jesus arrived, or if she was just in a coma. But you know what? I think this is a tale of resurrection, no matter how you look at it. The resurrection stories that we see here show us how Jesus' healing can come in many, many forms, including the healing of taboos that exclude and isolate people from the fullness of living. I'm personally drawn to the story of the woman. I mean, I have known lots of women who have suffered through years of painful, constant, and heavy bleeding, while their older male doctors said, it's just one of those time of life things. Now, it could have been uterine fibroids, which has a medical remedy, or it could have been something like cancer, which is much more treatable the earlier that it's caught. But it took these friends of mine seeing younger doctors, less inhibited by the taboos around woman in today's gospel is not used to being listened to either. She's exhausted all of her resources and she's received no cure. She's probably living in poverty and she has been excluded from the mainstream society because of her condition. His cloak. Now, Jesus could have just let her fade away with just as little notice. I mean, she was healed after all. Isn't that what matters? But Jesus, instead, by speaking, opens himself up to more controversy, because touching a woman who was ritually clean, that gets him in trouble all the time. But Jesus chooses to make it public. He makes sure that everybody knows. By publicly lauding her faith and declaring her healed, Jesus confronts that taboo head on, the one that's associated with menstruation in his culture. He just opens that wide for her to have a new and more abundant life. Now, surrounding this episode with a resurrection story about Jairus' daughter only serves to reinforce the point. Whether it's physical healing or the removing of social stigma, there are all sorts of ways that Jesus has come to defeat death and to restore life. One of them, we learned today, is the challenging of oppressive taboos. By talking about the hard things that we have been conditioned to avoid talking about. Stuff like menstruation. Now, here we are today. It's nearly 2,000 years after Jesus freed this unnamed woman from both pain and stigma and discomfort with menstruation talk. Well, it is alive and well, let me tell you. I mean, some of you are probably squirming in your seats every time I mention that word, aren't you? I came across a TED Talk by an Indian woman named Aditi Gupta that opens like this. Menstruation, gross, secret, hidden. Why? Gupta goes on to say that this natural biological process that every woman or girl goes through every month for over half of her life, it's something that the survival, the propagation of our species, in fact, depends upon it. And yes, it is taboo to talk about it all over India. She says parents are uncomfortable explaining it to their young girls, but it's not even covered in the school curriculum until 3 or 4 years after most girls have reached the age of first menses. And in fact, her teacher skipped the lesson entirely when they got to it. So many girls start their periods without even knowing what or why is happening to them. Now, between those kinds of social restrictions and actual physical problems like the lack of clean water and access to periods, to products to manage their periods hygienically, something like 88% of girls in India don't have hygienic ways to manage their periods. They miss school, and they are at risk for things like reproductive tract infections. In fact, UNESCO figures that globally girls miss 10 to 20% of instructional time due to period poverty and stigma. Gupta and her husband created a comic book about 3 young Indian girls learning about their periods. It uses color and culturally sensitive language and illustrations to draw out and open up conversations so that young girls and young boys can learn about this. Then they went off and they raised the money to get it out to as many boys and girls as they could across India. Now, there are schools and volunteer educators using their comic book and having it translated even so it can go out into other countries around them. Now, I have to say I cried watching her speak about this. I mean, by talking through the taboos and teaching the hard things, Gupta and her husband brought new life for girls across India and beyond. Now, lest we think we are any better, we have plenty of this type of healing to do here too. You know how my other job is placing children's authors in schools? Well, I have to tell you, I can only find one middle school that was willing to take the author of the book, Go with the Flow, which, you guessed it, it is an educational graphic novel about menstruation and period equity. One school willing to have this author come speak. You see, David was right. We have to teach the hard stuff too. Lives depend upon it, especially the lives of our next generation. Jesus saw the destructive power of social taboos that kept people in his culture in poverty, physical suffering, and social and spiritual isolation. Jesus brought healing and resurrection every time that he challenged one of these taboos by talking about it and treating everyone that he met as if they are fully human and deserving of God's love and welcome into God's kingdom no matter what. As followers of Jesus, we can do that too. I mean, think of all of the other stuff in our society that is hard to talk about. Addiction, mental health, racism, homophobia, sexual abuse. There is a list. I mean, we could be here all day counting the ways that this kind of silence has hurt and killed bodies and souls. Now, imagine all of the healing that we can be a part of by helping to shatter these taboos through our own willingness to engage in what are admittedly difficult, embarrassing, and uncomfortable conversations. Taboo just means the hard things that we would rather avoid talking about. It can be a deadly disease, but we've been shown by Jesus how to heal it. Whether it's physical healing or removing social stigma, there are all sorts of ways that Jesus came to defeat death and restore life. This is a resurrection story that we're part of too. Amen.